The final chord of Mahler's Ninth faded into breathless silence. 11,000 souls held still, spellbound. Then the scream. On the podium, Maestro Victor Karelnovo vanished. Only his baton spun slowly where he had stood, his tailcoat folded with impossible neatness, white gloves placed like a corpse's hands. No trapdoor, no smoke, no trace. From box 12, Hercule Poirot watched the impossible become murder. On the blood-stained score, 4 words glistened in fresh crimson ink. The symphony is finished, yet somewhere above, the organ gave a low, hungry groan, and the music was only just beginning. Chapter 1. The Final Note. The last chord of Mahler's Ninth Symphony hung in the vast golden dome of the Royal Albert Hall like a dying man's final breath, immense, sorrowful, and unwilling to leave the world. 11,000 people sat in perfect silence, afraid to shatter the spell. The air itself seemed thickened with the resonance of the brass, the lingering tremor of the harp, the ghostly aftering of the tam-tam. Even the dust motes that drifted through the great beams of the spotlights appeared to pause in reverence. On the podium, Maestro Victor Karelnovo held his baton aloft for 1 heartbeat longer than any conductor dared. His lean frame rigid, his silver hair blazing under the lights, his black eyes burning with the terrible ecstasy that only the greatest artists know when they stand at the edge of the abyss and stare straight into it. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered his arms. The silence deepened until one could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the audience. And then the scream came. It was not a polite English gasp. It was a raw, animal sound that tore through the hush like a cracked cymbal dragged across stone. A woman in the front stalls leapt to her feet, her program fluttering to the carpet like a wounded white bird. She pointed with a trembling hand that seemed suddenly boneless. Every head in the hall turned as though pulled by a single string. 11,000 pairs of eyes fixed upon the podium. Maestro Victor Karelnovo was no longer there. Only his baton remained. Spinning slowly on the polished mahogany of the conductor's stand, as though some invisible hand had just released it. His black tailcoat lay folded, with unnatural neatness, exactly where his feet had been a moment before. The white gloves placed atop it, like the hands of a corpse arranged for burial. The orchestra sat frozen in their chairs, bows suspended in mid-air, mouths half open beneath the great curve of the proscenium arch. The first violinist, Mr. Elias Cohen, still had his instrument tucked beneath his chin, but his bow hovered an inch above the strings, trembling as though the horsehair itself were afraid. I, Hercule Poirot, was seated in box 12, a position that afforded an unobstructed view of the entire auditorium, and, more importantly, the stage. Beside me, my old friend Captain Arthur Hastings had been leaning forward, utterly transported by the music. Now he sat bolt upright, his program crushed in one fist. "Good Lord, Poirot," he whispered, his voice cracking like a schoolboy's. "Did you see that? The fellow simply vanished." I did not reply immediately. My eyes were busy. They took in the impossible tableau. No trapdoor. I had inspected the stage myself, only yesterday at the invitation of the hall manager. No curtain swift enough to conceal a man. No wires glinting in the spotlights. No puff of theatrical smoke. One moment the maestro had been there, a figure of demonic energy, his arms slicing through the air with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a lover. The next moment there was only absence, a void shaped exactly like a human being. A second scream, this one male, rose from the orchestra pit. The timpanist, a burly German named Otto Reinhardt, had dropped one of his sticks. It rolled across the stage and came to rest against the neatly folded tailcoat. The sound it made, small and wooden, was the first ordinary noise to break the spell. After that, pandemonium blossomed like blood in water. People surged to their feet. Evening gowns rustled like startled ravens. Pearl necklaces clattered as ladies clutched at their throats. A portly gentleman in the grand tier stood on his seat and bellowed for the police. Somewhere in the upper circle, a woman fainted clean away, sliding from her velvet chair with a soft thump that no one noticed. Ushers in their crimson uniforms ran down the aisles, waving their arms and shouting for calm, but their voices were lost beneath the rising tide of human terror. Yet no one, no single soul in that vast throng, had seen the maestro leave the stage. The great doors at every exit remained closed and guarded. The performance had ended only seconds earlier, and the house lights were still dimmed for dramatic effect. The spotlights, merciless, continued to blaze down upon the empty podium, as though expecting the vanished man to reappear for his ovation. From my vantage point, I observed Chief Inspector Japp, my old acquaintance from Scotland Yard, pushing his way along the orchestra rail. His bowler hat was askew, his usually placid face flushed with alarm. He vaulted onto the stage with surprising agility for a man of his build and began barking orders. Constables appeared as if conjured. Within moments, the exits were sealed tighter than the Bank of England. 11,000 witnesses, and not one of them able to explain what they had just seen. Hastings gripped my sleeve. "It's black magic, Poirot. Has to be. The fellow sold his soul for that performance, and the devil came to collect." I permitted myself the smallest of smiles. "Non, mon ami. The devil, when he comes, leaves footprints of brimstone and the smell of singed silk. This disappearance is far too tidy for infernal intervention. Observe how the coat is folded, military precision. Observe how the gloves are placed, exactly parallel. And, observe, most important of all, the baton." The baton had ceased its lazy spinning. It now pointed due north, toward the great organ that loomed above the stage like a cliff of golden pipes. In the shocked silence, its ivory tip seemed almost accusatory. Japp spotted me in the box and waved urgently. I rose, smoothing my waistcoat, and made my way down the crimson-carpeted stairs with the calm of a man strolling to afternoon tea. The crowd parted before me like the Red Sea before Moses. They sensed, perhaps, that here was someone who might impose order upon chaos. As I stepped onto the stage, the orchestra parted as well. I felt their eyes upon me, fearful, pleading, desperate for rational explanation. The air smelled of rosin, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of terror. I approached the podium slowly, my patent leather shoes making no sound on the polished wood. The tailcoat was still warm. I touched the fabric lightly with 2 fingers. Body heat. The maestro had been standing here no more than 30 seconds ago. I lifted the gloves. The inside of the right one was damp with perspiration. I raised the baton to the light. A single dark red spot, no larger than a sixpence, marred the ivory near the tip. I brought it to my nose. The scent was faint but unmistakable. Blood. Somewhere in the darkness above us, a single violin began to play. It was the concertmaster, Elias Cohen, his face ashen. The notes he drew from his Stradivarius were slow, mocking the ancient plainchant of the Dies Irae, Day of Wrath. One by one, the other strings joined him until the entire orchestra was playing a ghostly requiem for a man who might, or might not, still be alive. The house lights came up at last, harsh and merciless. Women began to weep openly. Men shouted questions that no one could answer. I turned to Japp. "Mon cher inspecteur," I said quietly, "you will find the maestro. Of that I am certain." The question is not whether he is dead, but how exquisitely he has been killed. Japp stared at me as though I had taken leave of my senses. Dead? We don't know that, Poirot. He might have been kidnapped, spirited away. Non, I indicated the baton with a delicate gesture. A man does not bleed from the tip of his own baton, and then politely fold his coat before departing for captivity. No, Victor Karolnovo is dead, and the manner of his death was choreographed with more precision than the symphony we have just heard. At that moment, a young woman pushed through the ring of constables. She was pale as parchment, her auburn hair escaping its pins, her secretary's notepad clutched to her chest like a shield. I recognized her instantly, Miss Felicity Carstairs, the maestro's private secretary. "Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, "there is something you must see at once. On the maestro's score, written in red." She led us to the music stand. The leather-bound score of Mahler's Ninth lay open to the final page. Across, the last bars, scrawled in fresh crimson ink that still glistened wetly under the lights, were 4 words in a hand that trembled with theatrical flourish. "The symphony is finished." Beneath the words, a single drop of blood had fallen and spread into the shape of a tiny, perfect 8th note. I looked up into the towering pipes of the organ that loomed above us like the gateway to some golden hell. Somewhere in that labyrinth of metal and wind, I felt certain, the final movement was only just beginning. And Hercule Poirot, for the first time in many years, felt the exquisite thrill of a chase that might yet prove worthy of his little grey cells. Chapter 2. The Body in the Organ Loft. The great hall, so lately throbbing with Mahler's farewell to life, now lay cold and cavernous under the merciless glare of the electrician's lamps. And at 4:17 in the morning, the discovery was made that turned impossibility into nightmare. A young constable, sent to search every corner of the building lest the maestro had merely fainted in some forgotten alcove, climbed the iron ladder that spiraled up behind the proscenium arch, like the backbone of a fossilized serpent. He carried a bull's-eye lantern, whose beam danced across decades of dust and cobwebs. And when that beam finally settled upon the interior of the great organ swell box, 60 feet above the stage, the boy let out a sound that was half scream, half prayer. Victor Karolnovo was there, wedged upright among the towering ranks of pipes, as though the instrument itself had swallowed him alive. His evening dress was immaculate, his silver hair sleek, his patent shoes gleaming, yet from the centre of his chest protruded the ivory handle of his own baton, driven home with such force that only 3 inches remained visible. The blood that had soaked his white waistcoat and shirt front had already dried to a stiff blackish crimson, and his eyes, those famous burning eyes, stared straight ahead in an expression of astonished betrayal, as though even in death he could not believe the orchestra had dared play a wrong note. Word travelled down the ladder faster than the constable himself, and within moments, Chief Inspector Japp was organising a human chain of officers to bring the body down without further disturbing the scene. I stood beneath the vast cliff of golden pipes and watched the solemn procession. The maestro, stiff as a tailor's dummy, was lowered in a cradle of policemen's arms until at last he rested once more upon the stage where, only 5 hours earlier, 11,000 people had applauded him to the echo. The hall that had thundered with bravo now echoed only with the scrape of boots and the horrified whispers of men who had thought they had seen everything. Dr. Jameson, the police surgeon, knelt beside the corpse and made his preliminary examination by the light of a constable's torch. "Dead between 10:40 and 10:50, he announced brusquely, and the deadly weapon entered the heart from above, at a downward angle of approximately 30 degrees. Whoever struck the blow was standing higher than the victim and used considerable force. Rigor is only just beginning. The body is still warm. Warm. The word hung in the frigid air like an obscenity. I approached and studied the baton. It had been plunged clean through the breastbone. The ivory was splintered where it had struck cartilage, and the cork grip was sticky with congealed blood. Yet the tails of the coat showed no corresponding tear. The garment had been opened, the shirt and waistcoat unbuttoned, the blow delivered, and then every button fastidiously refastened before the corpse was carried aloft. Such calm, such meticulous care in the midst of murder, chilled me more than the January wind that now whistled through the loading doors. I looked upward. The swell box was closed and secured by a heavy brass padlock on the outside. The hasp showed brilliant scratches where the tongue of the lock had been forced home only hours ago, yet the dust on the narrow catwalk leading to it was undisturbed save for the constable's fresh footprints. No ladder had stood there. The iron rungs bolted to the wall were the only access, and they too were thick with ancient dust, except where the constable had climbed. Someone had carried a grown man, dead weight, 60 feet straight up a vertical ladder, placed him inside the swell box, closed the door, and snapped a padlock that had never been tampered with. Impossible. Deliciously impossible. Jap, perspiring despite the cold, introduced me to the 5 persons who had enjoyed closest access to the maestro in life. They stood in a miserable semicircle near the conductor's podium, lit from above by a single spot that turned their faces to tragic masks. First came Sir Reginald Haverford, chairman of the Philharmonic Society, florid, stout, and trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. His company faced financial ruin if Carol Novo carried out his threat to resign before the American tour. Beside him, tall and regal, even in distress, stood Madame Valentina Roskova, the Russian soprano whose affair with the maestro had ended in public scandal only 3 weeks earlier. Her black eyes glittered like chips of obsidian beneath the diamonds at her throat. Dr. Lucien Ballard, the assistant conductor, young, handsome, and pale as chalk, kept twisting a silk handkerchief between bloodless fingers. Promotion had just fallen into his lap like a ripe peach. Miss Felicity Carstairs, the maestro's private secretary, seemed scarcely able to stand. Her small gloved hands clutched a sodden handkerchief, and her auburn hair had escaped its pins entirely. Last of all loomed Otto Reinhardt, the principal timpanist, massive and silent, his great bearded head bowed as though listening for a cue that would never come. Only yesterday, he and Carol Novo had quarrelled so violently in the corridor that musicians had fled in alarm. Each, when questioned, swore upon whatever they held sacred that they had never left their seat during the final movement. Each possessed a motive bright as a spotlight. Each, I noted, with the satisfaction of a collector discovering rare butterflies, was lying in some particular. Sir Reginald's programme was creased, as though it had been clenched in a furious fist. Madame Roskova's evening wrap bore a faint smear of rosin on the inside, rosin used only by string players. Dr. Ballard's patent shoes were scuffed at the toes as though he had climbed something in haste. Miss Carstairs' gloves were wet at the fingertips, though she had not wept in our presence, and Reinhardt's huge hands trembled as he polished an already spotless timpani stick with a rag that smelled faintly of gun oil. I turned my attention once more to the organ loft. The swell box had been opened inward. The padlock, therefore, could only be fastened from the outside. Yet no key had been found on the body, and the stage carpenter swore the only duplicate hung on a numbered hook in his office, untouched since 1929. I climbed the iron ladder myself, slowly, feeling the cold bite through my gloves. Inside the swell box, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and ancient varnish. The maestro's body had left a perfect silhouette in the thick dust on the floor. Around it, nothing, no scuffle marks, no drag lines, only that single accusing outline. I examined the rear wall of pipes. One rank, the 16-foot diapason, had been pushed slightly askew, revealing a narrow cavity behind. Something had been hidden there recently. The dust was smeared, but whatever it was had been removed. As I descended, the first pale stain of dawn crept through the high windows and turned the golden pipes the colour of old blood. Somewhere in the deserted auditorium, a loose seat banged shut with a sound like a pistol shot. Japp approached, hat in hand, looking 10 years older than when the evening began. "Well, Poirot," he said heavily, 11,000 witnesses, and not whether one of them saw a thing. The Yard's going to have my head on a platter for this." I smoothed my moustaches and regarded the empty podium where only hours before genius had stood incarnate. "Non, mon ami," I replied softly. "They saw everything. They simply did not understand what their eyes beheld. The murder was committed in full view of 11,000 people, with the orchestra as accompaniment and the Royal Albert Hall itself as the perfect instrument of death. Somewhere in this building the score is still being played, and Hercule Poirot intends to conduct the final movement himself." Above us, the great organ gave one low, involuntary groan, as though the building itself protested the blasphemy that had been committed within its ribs. The game, as they say, was most emphatically afoot. Chapter 3. The Threatening Letters. The morning after the murder, London awoke to screaming headlines that turned the Royal Chirurg at Albert Hall into a mausoleum of ink and newsprint. Yet, inside the hall itself, the silence was more terrible than any clamour, broken only by the occasional creak of a seat or the distant drip of condensation from the great dome. Chief Inspector Japp had established his headquarters in the conductor's dressing room, a handsome panelled chamber behind the stage that smelled of Russian leather, cognac, and the ghost of expensive cigars. There, spread across Carrel Novo's own walnut desk, like a sinister deck of cards, lay 7 letters that had arrived at intervals over the past 3 months, each typed on cheap cream paper, each bearing the same chilling signature in violent red ink. "When the last note sounds, you will vanish forever." The final letter, postmarked only the previous day, carried an additional line scrawled beneath the familiar threat: "Tonight, the symphony ends." The red ink was still faintly tacky when I touched it, and under the magnifying lens I observed tiny crystals that sparkled like powdered garnets. Carmine lake, the pigment favoured by painters of miniatures, not the common vermilion of commercial inks. Curious, very curious indeed. Miss Felicity Carstairs, summoned from her tiny office adjoining the dressing room, stood before us white as the letters themselves. Her small hands knotted so tightly that the knuckles gleamed like ivory. She admitted, in a voice scarcely louder than the ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel, that she typed all the maestro's correspondence upon a Remington portable that lived upon her own desk. Yet she swore by the Blessed Virgin that she had never seen these letters before this morning. When Japp asked why the drawer had been locked, she replied that the maestro himself had locked it the previous afternoon, saying only, "Some things are better kept private until after the concert, my little nightingale." The endearment delivered in Karolnovo's famous Slavic purr, had made her blush crimson at the time. Now it caused fresh tears to spill down her cheeks and fall, unnoticed, onto the carpet already stained with the maestro's cologne. Sir Reginald Haverford arrived next, puffing and purple with indignation, demanding to know why the hall had not yet been released for rehearsal. When shown the letters, he blustered that they were obviously a publicity stunt, orchestrated by Karolnovo himself. The man had a passion for melodrama, second only to his passion for money. He threatened to resign last month unless we doubled his fee for the American tour, Sir Reginald barked, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief already soaked through. £80,000 at stake, gentlemen! 80,000! The man would have staged his own kidnapping for the headlines. Yet I observed that the chairman's own fingers trembled as he handled the final letter. And when he laid it down, the paper bore a faint crescent of perspiration where his thumb had rested. Fear, not anger, was the emotion that truly coloured his cheeks. Madame Valentina Roskova swept in like a storm cloud wrapped in sable and diamonds, announcing that she had come only to collect her score of Strauss that the maestro had borrowed. Shown the letters, she gave a low, throaty laugh that made the crystal decanters on the sideboard tremble. Victor always said he would rather die on the podium than conduct second-rate musicians again, she declared, examining her reflection in the mirror as though the murder were merely another performance. Perhaps he arranged his own disappearance, oui? A little trapdoor, a little smoke, poof! The greatest exit since Whodunit. Her dark eyes met mine in the glass, challenging, mocking. Or perhaps one of his little admirers finally grew tired of being discarded like yesterday's bouquet. She touched the diamonds at her throat, diamonds Karolnovo had given her during their affair, and demanded back the night he dismissed her from the upcoming Salzburg production. The gesture was unconscious, yet it spoke volumes. Dr. Lucien Ballard, summoned from the orchestra room where he had been nervously rearranging music stands, turned the colour of skimmed milk when he saw the letters. He produced, with the air of a conjurer revealing a rabbit, a medical observation. The angle of the baton wound suggested the killer was at least 6 feet tall, considerably taller than the maestro's own 5'10". Ballard himself measured a modest 5'8" in his conductor's patent shoes. Convenient, I thought. Very convenient. Yet his shoes bore fresh scuffs on the patent leather, and when he placed his hands upon the desk to steady himself, I noticed a faint smear of red upon the cuff of his left sleeve, exactly the same carmine shade as the threatening words. He saw me see it, and the blood drained from his face so completely that I feared he might faint. Only Otto Reinhardt, the timpanist, remained outwardly calm. He stood like a monument carved from granite, his great bearded head bowed, polishing the same walnut timpani stick with a slow, mechanical rhythm. When shown the letters, he merely shrugged and said in his thick Berlin accent, "The maestro had many enemies. He conducted like a tyrant and loved like a Cossack. Someone finally struck back." Yet I noticed that the muscles along his jaw worked continuously, as though he were chewing upon words he dared not spit out. And when Japp asked where he had been seated during the final movement, Reinhardt replied that he had never left the timpani, not even to turn a page, an answer that was technically true, for the timpani part in the Adagio of Mahler's Ninth consists of only 4 thunderous strokes spread across 12 minutes. 4 opportunities to leave the stage unnoticed, 4 opportunities to climb that iron ladder under cover of the orchestra's colossal climaxes. Before we left the dressing room, I tasted the dregs of a cup of cocoa that had stood untouched upon the maestro's desk since the previous evening. Bitter almonds, cyanide, almost certainly. Yet the post-mortem would later confirm that no trace of poison had entered Karolnovo's stomach. The cocoa had been intended to create panic, nothing more, a diversion, a red herring swimming in chocolate. Someone had known we would look for simpler explanations first, someone extraordinarily clever. As we emerged into the vast auditorium, the winter sun slanted through the high windows and struck the golden pipes of the organ until they blazed like the trumpets of judgment. Somewhere in that labyrinth of metal, a single stop had been pulled. A low F, the pitch of doom itself, rumbled through the building and died away into silence. No human hand had touched the console. The organist had been dismissed hours earlier. Hastings at my elbow crossed himself instinctively. Even Japp looked uneasy. I stood beneath the great instrument and felt the vibration die in my very bones. "Observe, mes amis," I said softly. The threatening letters promised that the maestro would vanish when the last note sounded. The last note has sounded. The maestro has vanished. And yet the music, yes, the music continues. Somewhere in this hall, the orchestra is still playing, and Hercule Poirot intends to discover who holds the baton now. Above us, the organ gave another involuntary groan, deeper this time, as though the building itself were warning us that the symphony of death was far from finished. Chapter 4. The Impossible Alibis. Midnight found us once more in the conductor's dressing room, where the air still carried the faint, expensive ghost of Karolnovo's cologne, mingled now with the sharper scent of fear. And I, Hercule Poirot, had arranged the 5 principal suspects in a half-circle beneath the merciless electric chandelier, like soloists awaiting a verdict that none of them wished to hear. They sat upon a mismatched assortment of gilt chairs dragged in from the green room, Sir Reginald Haverford wheezing and crimson, Madame Roscova draped in black velvet and defiance, Dr. Ballard pale and twitching, Miss Carstairs small and white as a communion wafer, Reinhardt massive and silent, while Chief Inspector Japp stood behind me like a bulldog straining at the leash. And Hastings, dear, honest Hastings, hovered by the door with his notebook ready and his eyes wide as a child's at the pantomime. I placed upon the walnut desk 5 concert programs taken from their very pockets and handbags, not an hour earlier, each one apparently identical, yet each one subtly, damningly different. And I began to speak in the quiet, precise voice that I reserve for those moments when the little grey cells are singing in perfect harmony. "Observe," I said, laying the programs side by side like the 5 books of Moses. "Observe that during the final adagio, the ushers, as is their custom on premieres, passed along the rows checking seat numbers against a master list, marking the exact minute upon every program with a tiny pencil. It is done to prevent gatecrashers and royalty alike from wandering into the wrong box. Sir Reginald's programme bore the minute 10:42, the precise instant the house lights dimmed to darkness and the final movement began. Yet Sir Reginald had sworn he never moved from his stall until the scream. Madame Roscova's programme was entirely blank, pristine as the Siberian snow. She claimed no usher would dare approach the royal box where she sat alone, wrapped in sables and fury. Yet the head usher remembered her box quite empty for the last 12 minutes of the performance. Dr. Ballard's programme carried a perfect crimson lip print upon the title page, Valentina's Shade. Russian passion, impossible to mistake, though he insisted he had spent the entire adagio in the orchestra room correcting parts. Reinhardt's program had been torn clean in half, the lower portion missing altogether, as though someone wished to destroy evidence of a time. Only Miss Carstairs' program was unmarked, untouched, innocent as a child's prayer book. Yet, when I held it to the light, I saw the faint indentation of writing, made upon a sheet that had once rested above it, writing made with considerable pressure, the pressure of terror or of rage. I then produced, from the depths of my overcoat pocket, a wax cylinder still warm from the BBC recording van parked outside the hall the previous night. The engineers had captured the entire symphony for a future broadcast, and when I placed the cylinder upon the portable phonograph Japp had borrowed from evidence, I turned the speed to 1/4 normal. The great adagio unfolded in a ghostly slow motion, horns groaning like dying elephants, strings weeping in quarter time, until at precisely 10:44 and 12 seconds, there came a sound no listener had noticed in the hall itself, a sharp metallic click, clear as a gunshot in that glacial tempo, the click of the swell box door opening and closing 60 feet above the stage. The hall electrician summoned earlier confirmed that the only access to the swell box was the vertical iron ladder behind the proscenium arch, a ladder in full view of the timpani section throughout the performance. Reinhardt, seated directly beneath that ladder, had therefore enjoyed the finest view in the house of anyone who might have climbed it. Yet he claimed to have seen nothing but his own music. At this point, Sir Reginald exploded, calling the entire proceeding a farce and threatening to telephone the Home Secretary. But I silenced him with a single raised finger and produced my next exhibit. A pair of white kid gloves taken from Miss Carstairs' handbag, gloves still faintly damp at the fingertips, though the lady had shed no tears in our presence. The dampness, when tested with a strip of litmus, proved to be violin rosin dissolved in spirits of wine, the exact mixture used by orchestral players to clean their strings, a mixture found in no lady's reticule, unless she had recently wiped something clean with frantic haste. The iron ladder, I reminded them, had been found spotless, devoid of fingerprints or scuff marks, despite the fact that a man carrying a corpse must have climbed it twice. Someone had wiped it clean in the dark, between thunderous strokes of the timpani, using the only cloth-available gloves pulled from trembling feminine hands. Japp, unable to contain himself any longer, burst in with the news that the missing tailcoat had at last been discovered, rolled into a tight ball, and stuffed inside the case of the principal double bass, an instrument that had remained on stage, played by Mr. Elias Cohen throughout the entire performance. The coat was soaked in blood, yet bore no bullet holes or stab wounds, save the one neat perforation now occupied by the baton itself. The coat, therefore, had been removed after death, carried away, and returned to the stage later like a macabre boomerang. Someone among the orchestra had opened that bass case during the adagio, slipped the coat inside, and closed it again without the player noticing possible, only because the double bass, at the rear of the section, turns its back to the conductor and the ladder. I dismissed them then with a warning that rang like a bell in the sudden silence. Tomorrow night, the orchestra would perform Mahler's Ninth again. A memorial concert insisted upon by the players themselves, and Hercule Poirot would be watching from the organ loft itself. As they filed out, Sir Reginald muttering, Valentina laughing low in her throat, Ballard trembling, Reinhardt impassive, and Miss Carstairs whispering so softly that only I heard the words, "He was afraid of the organ, monsieur." He said it watched him. I stood alone beneath the chandelier and felt the little grey cells arrange themselves into a pattern almost too beautiful to be true. Somewhere in the vast building, a seat slammed shut with the finality of a judge's gavel, and from the great organ far above came a single chord, soft as a dying breath, played by no human hand, a chord in the exact key of the threatening letter's promise. The impossible alibis were crumbling like stage scenery, and behind them the true shape of the crime began to emerge, terrible and magnificent. The symphony was not yet finished. It had merely modulated into a minor key. Chapter 5. The Dress Rehearsal of Death. The memorial concert was announced for 8 o'clock the following evening, and London, that great insatiable maw, swallowed the tickets in less than an hour. Society wished to prove it was not afraid of ghosts, and the merely curious wished to see whether lightning could strike the same podium twice. I spent the day in the empty hall with a tailor's dummy dressed in evening clothes, a stopwatch, and a length of fishing line, reconstructing the impossible until the little grey cells burned like a furnace. 90 seconds to climb the ladder, 90 seconds to return. Anything longer, and the absence would have been noticed even in the dimness of the adagio. Yet Carol Novo had been seen on the podium at 10:38 by 3 separate witnesses, the leader of the second violins, the stage manager, and a page boy bringing fresh handkerchiefs. Therefore, the body had to have been placed in the swell box earlier, hidden among the pipes like a violin in its case, waiting for the appointed moment. The stabbing itself had occurred on the stage, in full view of 11,000 people, but no one had realized the conductor was already dead. At 6 o'clock, I concealed myself inside the organ chamber, wedged between the 32-foot diaphone and the great swell box itself, in a space so narrow that my moustaches brushed the cedar panelling whenever I breathed. From here I could see through a crack in the louvre slats, directly down onto the podium. The air was thick with the scent of ancient wood and the faint metallic tang of the pipes. The orchestra filed in, black-clad and solemn, their faces pale masks beneath the working lights. Dr. Lucien Ballard took the podium with the nervous energy of a man who had waited years for this moment and now feared it might kill him. The audience settled like a dark sea. The house lights dimmed. At 10:30, the tuning A floated across the stage, fragile as frost. At 10:41, the spotlights blazed. Ballard raised the baton, the same baton that had pierced his predecessor's heart, now wiped clean and gleaming. The first violins entered with their heart-breaking pianissimo. I watched, scarcely daring to breathe, as the adagio unfolded in all its terrible beauty. The music swelled, crested, fell back like waves upon a midnight shore. And then, at 10:42 exactly, a figure in full evening dress climbed the iron ladder with the silent grace of a cat burglar. The spotlights did not catch him. He kept to the deep shadow behind the proscenium arch. Gloved hands, pale face obscured by the angle, the glint of the baton in one fist. He reached the swell box, opened it with a key that flashed once in the gloom, reached inside, and withdrew a small hypodermic syringe no longer than a fountain pen. A quick motion, almost tender, and the needle slid into something hidden among the pipes. Then the figure descended as silently as he had come, and vanished into the wings. I emerged from my hiding place the instant the climber's shoes touched the stage floor. The swell box stood open, the padlock hung loose, ready to be snapped shut later. Inside lay nothing but the faint imprint of a body in the dust, and a single drop of liquid trembling on the cedar floor, colourless, odourless, deadly. Curare, I knew at once, mixed with a paralytic refined enough to keep the victim conscious, yet utterly immobile. Carol Novo had been brought here hours earlier, drugged, bound, and hidden like a parcel awaiting delivery. The stabbing had been the final flourish, not the murder itself. I looked down at the podium. Ballard was conducting with demonic energy now, his arms slicing through the air with a precision that was almost too perfect, almost mechanical. And then I saw it thin black wires, no thicker than horsehair, running from the cuffs of the corpse's coat up through the pipes to a hidden mechanism in the loft. When Ballard raised his arms, the wires lifted the dead man's arms in perfect synchronization. When Ballard beat time, the corpse obeyed. The audience saw their beloved maestro one last time, conducting his own requiem from beyond the grave. At the climax, Ballard triggered a concealed spring. The baton plunged home. A hidden bladder of blood released its cargo for dramatic effect. Then, with the final tam-tam stroke, a counterweight activated. The harness folded the body like a marionette with cut strings and whisked it upward through a false panel into the swell box, all in less than 4 seconds. The padlock snapped shut from below by means of a hooked pole disguised as a music stand, wielded by a trembling feminine hand in the wings. I looked across the stage. Miss Felicity Carstairs stood half-concealed behind the contrabassoon, tears streaming down her face, clutching a length of catgut as though it were a rosary. She had loved Carol Novo with the desperate devotion of a discarded mistress. When he spurned her yet again for Valentina, she had agreed to help Ballard in exchange for the perfect revenge he would become principal conductor. She would watch the man who broke her heart die conducting his greatest triumph, unable to move, unable to scream, while 11,000 people applauded his corpse. The orchestra reached the final fading pianissimo. The audience sat in stunned silence, many weeping openly. Ballard lowered the baton that had killed his master and accepted the thunderous ovation with a bow so deep it was almost a confession. In the organ loft, the little grey cells sang a triumphant hymn. The impossible was no longer impossible. It had merely been waiting for Hercule Poirot to pull the curtain aside. As the house lights rose and the applause began to fade, a single organ pipe gave a soft, almost human sigh, the sigh of a building that had been forced to play accomplice to murder, and was now, at last, relieved of its terrible secret. The dress rehearsal was over. Tomorrow night the true performance would begin, and this time I would be holding the baton. Chapter 6. The Phantom Conductor. The hall emptied slowly after the memorial concert, the audience filing out in a daze of tears and whispered theories, while the orchestra lingered on stage like mourners, unwilling to leave the graveside. And I, Hercule Poirot, waited in the shadows of the organ loft until the last echo of applause had died, and only the working lights remained, harsh and pitiless. I descended the iron ladder with the silence of a cat, and made my way to the conductor's room, where Dr. Lucien Ballard stood alone before the mirror, still in evening dress, practicing his bow as though the applause had never quite satisfied him. He saw my reflection behind his own, and the smile froze upon his lips like frost upon a window-pane. "You conducted brilliantly tonight, Doctor," I said softly, closing the door with a click that sounded, in that small panelled room, like the closing of a trap. "Almost as if you had rehearsed upon a live subject, one might say." He turned, the baton still in his hand, and attempted a laugh that emerged thin and cracked. "Maestro Carol Novo coached me for months, Monsieur Poirot. Every gesture, every beat, he was a hard taskmaster." Hard indeed, I agreed, stepping closer, especially when the pupil drugs the master with curare and binds him among the organ pipes, so that the arms may be worked by hidden wires like a marionette in a street show. The blood drained from his face so completely that the rouge on his cheeks stood out like a clown's. The baton slipped from his fingers and rolled across the carpet until it struck the toe of my perfectly polished shoe. I picked it up, turned it slowly in the light. Tiny fibers of catgut still clung to the ivory where it had been driven through flesh and bone. "You are mad," he whispered, backing towards the desk. "You have no proof." "Non," I replied, and from my pocket I produced the small hypodermic syringe I had retrieved from the swell box only minutes earlier. The glass still held a bead of the paralytic mixture. Curare refined with a synthetic alkaloid known only to 3 laboratories in Europe, one of which supplies the London hospital where you, docteur, were employed until your passion for the baton proved stronger than your passion for medicine. He lunged then, not for the door, but for the drawer where a second syringe lay waiting poison for the detective who had come too close. I was ready. My stick, that innocent malacca with the silver band, caught him neatly across the wrist, and the syringe spun away, shattering against the hearth. Before he could cry out, Japp's men stationed in the corridor at my instruction burst in and had him in cuffs with the efficiency of long practice. While they led him away, Ballard recovered enough spirit to sneer. "You still have nothing that will stand in court. A few wires, a trick harness, any conjurer could have arranged it." I smiled and gestured toward the great organ visible through the open door. "Tonight, during your performance, the organ played a wrong note. Mahler's Ninth has no B-flat in the brass at bar 3 to 12. Yet a B-flat sounded, faint but unmistakable. Someone had tampered with the stops so that when the house lights rose to full, a single pipe was triggered by the electric current. Someone who wished me to look upward, to discover the mechanism before it could be dismantled. Someone, docteur, who decided that you should carry the whole blame while she escaped into the night." His eyes widened. "Felicity," he breathed, "précisément. Miss Carstairs is at this moment boarding the boat train to Dover with a passport in the name of Mrs. Victor Lawrence, a lady who died in childbirth 20 years ago and whose papers were never reclaimed. She believed that by leaving one small discord, she would direct suspicion solely upon you, the ambitious assistant who coveted the podium. But she underestimated Hercule Poirot. I turned to Japp. You will find the harness and counterweights still in place behind the 32-foot diapason. The wires run through the pipes like the nerves of the building itself, and in Miss Carstairs' office you will discover the Remington portable upon which the threatening letters were typed, together with a bottle of Carmine Lake pigment dissolved in gum arabic the exact shade of the warnings. Ballard sagged in the grip of the constables. She said we would share everything, he muttered. The glory, the tours, America. She said it would be our symphony. Instead, I replied gently, it became your requiem. As they took him out into the corridor, he began to laugh. A high, broken sound that echoed strangely among the empty music stands. The laughter stopped abruptly when the great organ far above us gave one sudden immense chord every stop pulled, every pipe speaking at once in a roar that shook the very foundations of the hall. The building itself seemed to cry out in triumph or in mourning. I could not tell which. Dust sifted from the rafters like golden snow. Somewhere, a seat slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. I stood alone beneath that mighty voice and felt the little grey cells settle into perfect order. The phantom conductor had been unmasked, the wires cut, the marionette laid to rest. Yet, as the organ's roar faded into silence, I found myself listening for another sound lighter footsteps, hurrying toward a cross-channel steamer. The rustle of a woman's skirt vanishing into the fog. One puppet had been caught, but the true puppet master, the broken-hearted nightingale who had written threats in blood-red ink and pulled invisible strings from the wings, was already beyond the reach of Scotland Yard. The symphony, I reflected, was not quite finished after all. Chapter 7. The red ink with Dr. Ballard in a cell at Paddington Green, and the harness of wires and counterweights dismantled by Japp's men. Before the press could photograph the infernal machine, Scotland Yard declared the case closed, and the newspapers printed triumphant headlines about the mad assistant conductor who had murdered his master for a podium. Yet Hercule Poirot remained unsatisfied, for the little grey cells refused to lie down like good children and sleep. The threatening letters still troubled me. The typewriter had indeed been Miss Carstairs. The carmine lake pigment matched the contents of a tiny porcelain jar found in her drawer. But the paper itself was expensive handmade stock, bearing the watermark of a Bond Street stationer who supplied only one regular customer in the orchestral world. Sir Reginald Haverford, chairman of the Philharmonic Society, and the man whose personal fortune was tied to the American tour like a drowning sailor to a raft. I paid a quiet call upon Sir Reginald at his mansion in Kensington Palace Gardens at an hour when decent folk are still abed, and I found him in his study, already dressed for the day in pearl-grey morning coat, trying without success to steady his hand sufficiently to pour coffee from a silver pot that trembled like a leaf in a gale. He knew why I had come the instant he saw my card, and the colour left his cheeks so completely that the liver spots stood out like islands on a white sea. I closed the study door, turned the key, and laid upon his blotter the 7 letters arranged in chronological order, the red ink threats glowing like fresh wounds. "Observe, Sir Reginald," I said softly, "how the first 3 letters are typed with a slightly misaligned E, a fault common to the Remington in the orchestral office, but from the 4th letter onward, the E sits perfectly level. Someone changed the ribbon and realigned the type bars. Someone who wished us to believe the secretary typed all 7 when, in truth, she typed only the last 3, the 3 composed after you, mon ami, had taken control of the campaign of terror." He tried to bluster, to threaten, to telephone his solicitor, but the words died in his throat when I produced from my pocket a single sheet of the same handmade paper, torn from the bottom of his own private stock, and bearing the faint impression of the last letter typed upon the pad above it. The pressure of the keys had been savage. The ghost of the words "Tonight the symphony ends" was clearly visible when held to the light. £80,000, I continued, the sum you personally guaranteed to American promoters. Carol Novo had discovered that you were diverting orchestra funds into your own failing companies. He intended to expose you at the farewell banquet in New York. Ruin, disgrace, perhaps prison. You could not allow that. So you conceived a murder so baroque that no one would look for simple embezzlement behind the fireworks. Sir Reginald sank into his chair as though the bones had been drawn from his body. "It was meant to be a disappearance only," he whispered, "a scandal that would force him to resign quietly. Ballard was ambitious. The girl was obsessed. They were perfect tools. I supplied the letters, the money for the mechanism, the promise of promotion and revenge. None of us intended actual murder until Karol Novo laughed at us in rehearsal 3 days ago, laughed and said he would see us all in hell before he let amateurs touch his orchestra. I nodded slowly. 3 killers, 1 symphony. The financier who pulled the purse strings, the assistant who dreamed of glory, the secretary who loved beyond reason. Ballard had built the harness, Felicity had typed the later letters and worked the counterweights from the wings. Sir Reginald had paid for everything and provided the paper upon which doom was written in red. Yet when the mechanism worked too well, when the spring released and the baton found its mark, each had believed the others intended only paralysis and terror, not death, a perfect chord of mutual deceit. I invited Sir Reginald to accompany me back to the Royal Albert Hall one final time. The streets were empty, the fog thick as wool, and the great building loomed ahead of us like a sleeping beast. I led him beneath the organ switched on a single spot that illuminated the empty podium. And there, upon the music desk, someone had opened the score of Mahler's Ninth to the final page. Across the dying bars, written in fresh carmine ink that still glistened wetly, were the words, "Your symphony is finished." Sir Reginald stared at them as though they were written upon his heart. The organ chose that moment to roar into life, every stop pulled, every pipe speaking at once in a cataclysm of sound that rattled the very bones of the building. He clapped his hands to his ears and screamed, a high, thin sound lost beneath the thunder. The chord sustained, grew, became the voice of judgment itself. He confessed everything on the way to the hospital heart attack brought on by terror, the doctors said. Felicity Carstairs had returned in the night, pulled the stops one last time as her farewell, and left the final message in the same red ink that had started the nightmare. By the time Japp's men reached Dover, the boat train had sailed. By the time they checked the passenger list, Mrs. Victor Lawrence had vanished into the morning mist rolling across the channel. Some say she threw herself from the deck somewhere off Folkestone. Others swear she reached Paris, and from there, Buenos Aires, living quietly on the money Sir Reginald had paid her, and painting porcelain miniatures signed with a tiny red musical note. Sir Reginald survived the night, but not the scandal. He died in prison 2 years later, still insisting that the organ had spoken his name. The orchestra never performed Mahler's Ninth again. The score remained locked in the archives with its final page stained forever in Carmine Lake. And on certain foggy evenings, when the hall is empty and the wind moves through the pipes like a distant breath, caretakers claim to hear a woman's footsteps hurrying along the organ loft, the faint rustle of silk, and then a single chord soft, almost tender, as though someone were saying goodbye to a lover who had betrayed her one time too many. I close the file with regret, but not surprise. Perfect crimes, mes amis, are like perfect symphonies. They require 3 movements: motive, execution, and silence. In this case, the silence belongs to a woman who loved not wisely but too well, and who vanished as completely as the conductor she helped to kill. The red ink has dried, the organ is mute, and Hercule Poirot must content himself with a solution that is complete in every respect save one. Justice, like certain arias, sometimes ends on an unresolved chord. Chapter 8. The Little Grey Cells. A week after Sir Reginald's confession, on a raw February afternoon when the Thames lay dull as pewter and the gas lamps were already flickering a light, Captain Hastings found me in my flat at 56B Whitehaven Mansions, seated before a small coal fire, with a cup of chocolate so thick it would have borne up a silver spoon. He burst in without ceremony, his honest face pink from the wind and indignation, waving a copy of the Times still damp from the presses. "I say, Poirot," he cried, "they've printed the whole thing as if it were a penny dreadful assistant conductor runs mad with jealousy, chairman ruined by embezzlement, secretary vanishes into thin air. Not a word about the wires, the curare, the organ mechanism. And they make you sound like some sort of stage magician who guessed the trick." I set the cup delicately upon the tray, dabbed my moustaches with a napkin of the finest cambric, and permitted myself the smallest of smiles. "My dear Hastings, the public wishes a simple melody, not a fugue in 12 parts. Let them have their mad assistant and their tragic love triangle. The truth is far too complicated for the breakfast table, and besides, certain details must remain, how shall I put it, between the orchestra and its conductor." He flung the paper into a chair and began pacing with that splendid British energy that always reminds me of a bloodhound who has lost the scent. "But dash it all, man, you solved the impossible. The fellow was dead before the last movement began, yet he conducted it. 11,000 people applauded a corpse, and you proved it with wires no thicker than a violin string. I still wake up sweating when I think of it." I leaned back, warmed my hands at the fire, and allowed the little grey cells to replay the entire score one final time, note by perfect note. It was simple, mon ami. Once one accepted the central impossibility that Karolnovo never actually disappeared from the stage. He was there the entire time, only he was no longer Karolnovo. He was a puppet worked by a living man who stood in the same spot only moments later. The substitution occurred during the single general pause in the adagio, those 12 seconds of total silence that Mahler demands after the great climax. In that pause, Ballard, already dressed in an identical tailcoat beneath his own, stepped forward as if to consult the score, slipped the harness over the paralyzed maestro's shoulders, attached the wires to the cuffs, and with the first downbeat of the final section, took command of both orchestra and corps. The audience saw only the seamless continuation of genius. They applauded the dead man's final gesture, because the living man made him give it. Hastings stopped pacing and stared at me as though I had begun speaking in ancient Greek, but the blood, the baton through the heart, released by a spring in the harness at the exact bar where Mahler writes fortissimo possibile. A small bladder concealed beneath the waistcoat burst. The baton, mounted on a telescopic rod, shot forward. The audience believed it was Karolnovo's own dramatic flourish. Then the counterweight, the counterweight was a masterpiece, whisked the folded body upward into the swell box in the space between two heartbeats. Miss Carstairs snapped the padlock from below with her hooked pole, and the trick was complete. He sank into a chair, running a hand through his hair. And the threatening letters? The red ink? Sir Reginald's paper, Felicity's typewriter after the fourth letter, Ballard's medical knowledge for the curare. 3 murderers, each believing the others intended only terror, not death. A perfect discord in 3 parts. The organ that played alone. Felicity's parting gift, she had wired certain pipes to the lighting circuit, so that when the house lights rose, the building itself sounded its own requiem. She wanted me to find the mechanism, to punish Ballard and Sir Reginald, while she escaped with the money and the memory of her revenge. Hastings was silent for a long moment, watching the firelight flicker across my symmetrical arrangements of objects on the mantel. "And you let her go," he said at last, not quite a question. I shrugged, a small, almost Gallic gesture. There was no evidence that would stand in an English court, only the word of 2 broken men and the testimony of Hercule Poirot. And besides, mon ami, she had already pronounced sentence upon herself. To love a man like Karolnovo, to help kill him, to vanish forever that is a punishment heavier than any judge could impose." He considered this, then gave a short, reluctant nod. "Still feels deuced unsatisfactory." "Life, Hastings, is rarely satisfactory. It is merely logical." I rose, went to the window, and looked down upon the slow brown river sliding past the embankment. Music, like crime, is composed of pattern, rhythm, and deception. Mahler's Ninth is a farewell to the world. Carolnovo's last performance was his farewell to life. The audience wept because they felt the truth without knowing it. Sometimes the most beautiful symphonies hide the ugliest motives, and the most perfect crimes are those that leave only silence behind. Hastings came to stand beside me. Somewhere far below, a barge sounded its horn, a low, mournful A-flat that hung in the damp air like a memory. Will you ever hear that symphony again without thinking of it? I turned from the window, smoothing my moustaches with a delicate forefinger. On the contrary, mon ami, I shall hear it always, and I shall remember that even in the presence of death, 11,000 people rose as one to applaud genius. That, at least, was true. The rest, the wires, the blood, the red ink was merely the price of the performance. I poured him a small glass of my finest Armagnac, and together we listened to the fire settle into embers, while the winter evening folded itself around London like a velvet curtain coming down upon the final act. The case of the Vanishing Conductor was closed, the score returned to its locked cabinet, the organ silent at last. Yet somewhere, I knew, a woman with auburn hair and eyes that had once looked upon love now looked only upon exile. And on certain nights she still heard the adagio in her dreams, played by a puppet whose strings she herself had pulled. Some resolutions, like certain chords, are best left unresolved. Chapter 9. Epilogue. 1 year later. On the first anniversary of the murder, an evening in late January when the wind off the Thames carried the bite of steel and the sky above Kensington Gardens was the colour of tarnished brass, I, Hercule Poirot, found myself drawn back to the Royal Albert Hall as irresistibly as a moth to a candle that had once burned its wings. The orchestra was performing Elgar's Enigma Variations, a gentle, very English balm after the storm of Mahler, and the great circle was full again, though many seats remained empty in superstitious memory. Of the night a conductor had vanished between two heartbeats. I took my old place in box 12. Alone this time, Hastings was in Argentina, pursuing a lady whose eyes, he claimed, were darker than any mystery. And I watched the new maestro, a quiet Swede with none of Carolnovo's demonic fire, raise his baton with the reverence of a priest elevating the host. The hall itself seemed to breathe more cautiously, as though it feared to disturb the dust that still lay upon certain pipes. The Nimrod variation rose like a slow tide of golden sound, and when the climax came, those noble, heart-breaking brass chords that always make Englishmen think of lost friends and lost empires, I became aware of a faint scent of violets alla Parma, a perfume I had last smelled in a corridor thick with terror. I turned my head very slowly. In the shadows of the adjacent box, half concealed by the crimson curtain, a woman sat alone, dressed from head to toe in black, her face hidden beneath a veil so heavy it might have been woven from midnight itself. Yet the line of the throat, the small gloved hand that rested upon the rail, the way she held her head slightly tilted, listening with the whole body, these things were unmistakable. The variation ended. Silence fell, deeper than any silence I have ever known in that hall. She lifted her veil. Felicity Carstairs looked exactly as she had the night she vanished, pale, composed, the auburn hair now cropped close beneath a black cloche hat, the eyes older by a century. She did not smile. She simply looked at me across the narrow gulf between the boxes. And in that look was everything: acknowledgement, regret, defiance, and something that might almost have been gratitude. Then, with the deliberate grace of a woman laying a wreath, she placed a single white rose upon the velvet ledge, its petals so pure they seemed to carry their own light. The thorns had been carefully removed. The orchestra began the next variation, soft strings and woodwind weaving a tender lullaby. She rose, the black silk of her gown whispering like a secret, and for one instant the house lights caught the glint of a tiny porcelain brooch at her throat, a miniature painted with a single red quaver note. Our eyes held across the gulf of music and memory. She raised one finger to her lips. The old universal gesture. Silence, and then she was gone, melting into the corridor as completely as Karanovo had once melted from the podium. I did not follow. Some curtains, once drawn, are never meant to be pulled back. Later, when the final chord of Elgar had faded and the audience was gathering gloves and programs, I went myself to the box. The white rose lay exactly where she had placed it, already wilting as though it had absorbed the sorrow of the hall. Beneath it, pressed into the velvet, was a small card-heavy cream stock, the same Bond Street watermark that had damned Sir Reginald. On it, in that familiar carmine ink now faded to the colour of dried blood, were 4 words only: "The Symphony forgives." I slipped the card into my pocketbook beside the dried petal of another white rose I have carried since the night of the crime. Then I descended the grand staircase, past the bust of Sir Henry Wood that gazes eternally toward the organ, and stepped out into the cold London night. The wind had dropped. The stars were sharp as diamonds scattered upon black velvet. Somewhere a taxi backfired with a sound like a distant timpani stroke. I never saw Felicity Carstairs again. The rose I planted in a pot upon my balcony, and for one spring it bloomed with impossible sweetness. Before it, too, withered and was gone. Yet on certain evenings, when I play the old recording of Mahler's Ninth, the one the BBC never dared broadcast, I fancy I hear, beneath the great adagio, the faintest rustle of silk in the organ loft, the soft closing of a swell box that no hand has touched in years. And once, only once, a single pipe gave a note so pure, so laden with regret, that I, Hercule Poirot, who do not believe in ghosts, found myself reaching to wipe away a tear that had no business upon the cheek of a man who trusts only the little grey cells. Some scores, mes amis, are never truly settled. They simply modulate into a key the ear cannot quite name, and the music goes on long after the conductor has laid down the baton forever. Chapter 10. Coda. And so, mes amis, the case of the Vanishing Conductor passed into the annals of crime as one of those rare affairs in which justice, like a great orchestra, played the final chord in a key no one quite expected. And Hercule Poirot, yes, even Poirot, allowed the curtain to fall before every instrument had been silenced. The newspapers grew, tired of the story once Sir Reginald was buried in Wormwood Scrubs Cemetery, and Ballard, white-haired at 32, was carried off to Broadmoor, muttering about wires that still tugged at his sleeves in the night. The Royal Albert Hall reopened its doors without ceremony. The organ was thoroughly cleaned and revoiced, and Mahler's Ninth, after a decent interval, returned to the repertoire under the tactful battle of Sir Adrian Boult, who conducted it with such restraint that no one in the audience ever again felt the chill of a corpse applauding itself. Yet legends like certain melodies refuse to die. On foggy November evenings, when the hall is locked and the caretaker makes his final round with the great ring of keys heavy as gilt, he will sometimes pause beneath the golden pipes and swear that he hears the faint tap-tap-tap of an ivory baton counting 4 beats in an empty auditorium, followed by absolute silence. The silence that falls when a conductor realizes the orchestra has stopped breathing. Musicians who rehearse late claim that the swell box door, now secured by a modern Yale lock, is occasionally found standing open in the morning, with a single white rose placed upon the dusty floor inside, its petals arranged in the exact shape of a quaver rest. No one can explain the roses. The florists of South Kensington have no record of such orders, and the night watchman insists that no living woman has passed the stage door since the new security system was installed. I myself returned only once more, on a January night so cold that the Thames had begun to freeze at the edges. I carried no warrant, no companion, only a small electric torch, and the memory of a woman who had loved not wisely, but too fiercely. The hall was deserted, the great spaces echoing to my solitary footsteps. I climbed the iron ladder for the last time, my breath clouding in the frigid air. And when I reached the swell box, I found the door already ajar. Inside, upon the exact spot where Victor Karelnovo had hung like a broken puppet, someone had laid a length of black silk cord, the same gauge as violin string, tied into a perfect hangman's knot. And beside it, a tiny porcelain miniature, no larger than a sixpence. It showed the head and shoulders of a man with silver hair and burning eyes. And across the breast was painted a single red note, an 8th note, bleeding. I took the miniature, slipped it into my waistcoat pocket next to the faded card that still reads, "The Symphony Forgives," and closed the swell box with my own hand. As I did so, the organ gave one low, voluntary groan, not the mechanical sigh of wind in old pipes, but a sound almost human, almost penitent. I stood in the darkness and listened until the groan became a whisper, and the whisper became silence. Then I descended, locked the gate behind me, and walked out into the frozen night without looking back. Years have passed since then. The world has marched through another war. Empires have crumbled, new music discordant, electric has replaced the romantic thunder of Mahler. Yet, in my quiet moments, when the little grey cells are at rest and the tisane is steaming beside my chair, I sometimes take out the porcelain miniature and turn it to the light. The painted eyes of Victor Karelnovo still burn with the same intensity they had in life, and the red note upon his breast has never faded. I think of Felicity, wherever she may be, under whatever name, in whatever city of exile, painting that tiny portrait with a squirrel hairbrush, and a heart that has never quite stopped bleeding. I think of Ballard rocking in his padded cell, humming the adagio to himself, in a voice cracked by drugs and despair. I think of Sir Reginald turning his face to the prison wall, so that no one would see him weep for the symphony he destroyed. And I think of the white roses that still appear, thornless and perfect, in a locked swell box 60 feet above an empty stage. There are crimes, mes amis, that no jury can judge, no handcuffs restrain. There are punishments more terrible than any gallows, the endless replaying of a single performance in which love, ambition and greed all took their solo bows and then vanished together into the wings. I solved the mystery of the Vanishing Conductor with every particular exact, yet the final cadence was not mine to write. It belongs to a woman who disappeared more completely than her victim ever did. and to a building that learned, on one unforgettable night, how to play the music of remorse without a single human hand upon the keys. The score is closed, the baton laid down, the house lights long since darkened. Yet somewhere, on certain nights when the wind moves through the pipes like breath through a throat that has forgotten how to speak, the Royal Albert Hall still performs its secret encore. 4 soft taps, a suspended chord, and then the silence that follows the last note of all. I do not believe in ghosts, you understand. I believe in order, in symmetry, in the impeccable logic of the little grey cells. But I keep the porcelain miniature upon my desk, and I never pass the hall without pausing for a moment beneath the great dome, listening, just listening.